What's going on, everyone? I'm Zero, and welcome back to Zero Two, where today I've got another banlist prediction for you. It's been a minute. I took a quick break from YouTube and streaming stuff to work on some personal stuff, go on a couple personal trips and whatnot, and also deal with my PC breaking. But I'm back. I'm on a regular setup again, and I'll be looking forward to uploading content on a more regular schedule, which is pretty cool. But without further ado, I wanted to do a quick banlist prediction video because the World Championships are coming up at the end of August, and I think now is a good time to talk over what cards I expect to get hit on the ban list. Keeping in mind that Justice Hunters came out so recently, and those decks will likely have proven to dominate the format and will likely continue to be some of the top dogs in the format. So, seeing how we can balance those decks slightly while keeping in mind that they're new and have just been released, so they likely won't get hit directly. Alongside some of the old guards still being quite strong, and Konami's likelihood to rotate them out of the format, so that way the new Justice Hunters decks can truly shine on their own. But yeah, some of these I took from someone else who made a starter tier list thing. Some of these I added myself. So we'll go through them all one by one and talk over why I think they'll end up on a certain slot on the ban list. But yeah, let's just jump into it because I don't want it to be too long. So starting out with Protoss, currently limited, will probably stay limited. Don't see this card coming back to 3. Don't see why it would come back to 3, but no decks right now are really abusing Protoss enough for it to be a severe issue. I know that Ryzeal can play the Infernal Flame Banshee into his flag line to get to Protoss, but that deck really already is struggling as it is. I think Ryzeal pure just doesn't have what it takes to compete against the top Justice Hunters decks. So I think that Protoss is a floodgate. It's quite cringe. In my personal opinion, it probably should have stayed banned forever, but I don't think it's really disrupting the game to a point at the moment where it needs to get banned. I think it's a card that will get banned eventually, but can stay limited for the moment because it's not really. Barrier statue, kind of in the same boat. I guess it's unlimited technically right now, and I don't necessarily seeing it change. I think this and Minstrel kind of fall in the same boat of being hit checks to Mermail. Although again, with the release of Justice Hunters, Mermail has shifted a significant number of rungs down the tiering list. I think it's probably already the fourth best deck before the release of Justice Hunters, and now after Justice Hunters, that moves it all the way down to like 7 or 8th, given how many different variants the new Justice Hunters decks you can play. But these two are still extremely frustrating to play against. I mean, Barrier Statue for water can completely shut out certain decks, and as well as Minstrel ripping your best interaction or potentially your only interaction means that they get to make this combo go off uninterrupted very frequently. Can also be quite frustrating. I actually do think that one of these will still likely get hit. I think that Konami hasn't completely forgotten about the Merlantian strategy. I think it has done fine enough at regionals to still warrant an eye. So I think of these two, they're more likely to ban the barrier statue. It'll join the other barrier statue banned for quite some time. I do think eventually most, if not all, of the barrier statues will have to end up on the forbidden limited list just because of how annoying of a floodgate they can be to deal with. So this one is a bit of a stretch. I understand if you think that Mermail doesn't deserve to get hit at all and should stay unlimited. So it's fine, but this is where I'm going to put it. And then, yeah, if not this getting banned, then this getting limited or banned. Dominus Impulse, someone put this on the tier list for me. I didn't put it on there, and I don't think it should get hit. I think that is a very strong hand trap. I think that decks can play it, benefit greatly from having it in their deck lists. But I don't think it does anything so unfair by itself that it should get banned or limited or semi-limited. It's already extremely restrictive in the fact that only certain attribute decks can play it. And a lot of the top decks at the moment from Justice Hunters can't afford to play it just because of their attribute spread. And so I don't think that Impulse is doing anything particularly unfair. I think the best deck that plays it right now is Malice, and certainly Impulse is a good part of Malice, but not the unfair part of Malice. So it can stay at 3. X Ryzeal's semi-limited. We're not going to hit X. I think unfortunately the Ryzeal cards are just not good enough to compete at a high level compared to the Justice Hunters decks. I think unlike Malice, who's proven to be quite resilient, the Mitsurugi cards are really what make the Mitsurugi Ryzeal strategy tick. against the top decks at the moment. I think that the Murakumo board wipe is huge against Yummy, and to a lesser extent, Vanquish Soul. I think that those cards adding a ton of consistency to the deck and layered portions to the end board are what makes the Mitsurugi Ryzeal strategy pop. So no need to hit X or by extension any of the Ryzeal cards. I'll stay where they are. I might even like to see Detonator come back from more than one copy because I don't think 2 Detonator changes any of the math for the Mitsurugi Ryzeal players at all. But it probably won't come back. It was just hit so recently, so I think that those will stay where they are. Engraver is a really interesting one. I think that Engraver is a card that is quite strong, searches the whole uh, Beansmith suite of starters, is a fantastic extender from Grave, and the engine has so few restrictions in it and locks, and starts from any 2 monsters turning into Closed Heaven that I think that still going to be see Splash in quite a few Justice Hunter strategies, and we are even still seeing Splash and stuff like Yummy because of the fact that this deck has a Link one that they can advantage of. I've seen Fiendsmith Canine variants floating around. Mitsurugi Fiendsmith is also a deck that's quite strong. And so I think that it's still seeing enough splashability where it's probably on Konami's radar to address, especially because they're reprinting the cards in new Megatins. A lot of times Konami likes to reprint and then immediately hit some of the more powerful staples of the previous formats when it comes to the Megatins. So I think I wouldn't be surprised to see Engraver go to semi-limited. Is it warranted? In my opinion, probably not. But again, this is my prediction of what I think Konami will do, not necessarily that I agree with all of these changes. Again, I'm kind of iffy on the barrier statue, although, like, personally, I love the barrier statue hit. I'm not sure if it's warranted this format particularly. And then with the engraver, I think they will probably like semi-limited it. I think the OCG has engraver either limited or semi-limited, so trying to find some parity there too is something I think that they'll try and consider, especially because I think that Konami has gotten a directive to try and increase the parity between all of their formats, that being OCG, Master Duel, and ECG, because they're really seeing Master Duel as their vector to get new players and new people joining on and getting excited about Yu-Gi-Oh! And it can frustrate new players when the formats are so different, like coming from Master Duel, where they just released Malice and Ryzeal, to the massive mash up that is the TCG with Mitsu Ryzeal and all the new Justice Hunters decks and stuff like that. It can be very overwhelming, and it becomes even more so when like engines that are in both variants are at different ratios. So you might see like in the OCG the limit, but when you go to Master Duel it's at 2, and then when you come to ECG is at 3. So I think people get that, and that's something Konami wants to try and reduce. So I could see it getting semi-limited for that reason, but again, I don't think it needs. Habakiri, and I think we'll talk about prayers at the same time because in my head these are kind of two of the same, although they also do act quite differently. Habakiri in multiple copies is very important as an extra body to ritual summon with. If you didn't have the extra bodies in deck, it can be very tricky when you're trying to do searches off of prayers, especially in the compact engine that Mitsurugi Ryzeal plays. And then vice versa, prayers is just kind of an all-in-one crazy card, and having it in multiple means that you can use it on your turn 1, leave that extra copy in graveyard, search 1 to 2 more for both your opponent's turn interruption and follow up for your next turn 3, and still have like just so much gas because it's a searcher, it's a summoner back from graveyard. It helps you tribute your big rituals to dodge interruptions and get their searches. It's an absolutely crazy card. So I think for that reason, one of these two will get limited, and in my opinion, it should be prayers. I think this is what they'll do. They'll limit prayers, keep Habakiri at 3. I think that the reason for this is limiting prayers to 1 means that the search targets in the smaller package Mitsu Splash engine variants become a lot less impactful, especially if you have to start with prayers as your starter, or if you need to use prayers during your combo to tribute Murakumo or something like that. You can no longer search that second copy and are therefore locked out of prayers unless you add it back off of Kusanagi. But if you add it back off the Kusanagi, you can't add back the ritual. So I think it really hurts the splashable engine variants of Mitsurugi. But I think this also promotes people to play a higher Mitsurugi count because Habakiri is still a full starter. You can play more ways to search Habakiri with something like an Aramasa. And so I think it keeps the pure Mitsurugi deck viable and intact. And a significantly larger Mitsurugi engine is also something that's still quite viable. But I think that with prayers, it's just a bit too splashable. This card is a bit too crazy to have in multiples. And so I think this is how they should address these two cards. Featherstorm is interesting. It saw a ton of play in Mitsurugi for a very brief period of time. I think when Charlie Futch topped one of the YCSs a couple months back with a variant that was playing Pastel as a rank 4 Wind Wing Beast to trigger your Featherstorm that you search off of Thrust, especially if you get hand trapped. And then as of more recently, there have been some yummy variants going around playing any number of either the Lyrilusk rank ones in a more generic build, or if you're playing the Mimigul variant, you can play the Ripple Bird as a pseudo combo piece, and also Windwing Beast for Featherstorm. However, I don't think either of those two are prominent now enough to warrant a Featherstorm hit. I do think this card is insanely cringe. I think shutting off monster effects for a turn just for interacting with your opponent is insanely ridiculous. I think this card will eventually be forbidden, but I think we're going to put it in limited just because it's not seeing enough play. But this is a candidate to get hit if it starts seeing more play coming in. Dormouse probably gonna stay semi-limited. This was one the other person made this put on the list. I don't think it's worth talking about Dormouse, but we can talk about the other cards that I did add in here for Malice that I think warrant some discussion. Those being March Hare and Whitebinder. I think that Konami is very likely with this ban list going to go somewhat of a scorched earth on older decks to make sure that the new Justice Hunter stuff gets played through. And I think that while I haven't really recommended that much scorched earth for Mitsurugi, I do think the limit to prayers is significant enough to cripple that deck and also just make it so you have to play pure Mitsurugi, which I think they're happy with. But what I think they don't want you to see happen is for people to still be playing Malice right up there with the top decks. With that in mind, I think they'll probably ban Whitebinder. I think that it's interesting though because there are a number of Malice combos that don't even necessarily need the Whitebinder. They almost all go through it, and the Whitebinder is a fantastic both extender for the deck, being able to banish stuff out of your graveyard to get extra bodies on the board. It sets your traps back from graveyard, so it's a lot of your grind game and recursion. And it also is an extra body that you summon back and get a draw off of, which is insane. Bring more resources over the course of a turn. So, still an insanely powerful piece. I think banning this really hurts Malice, but I don't think it kills the deck. It might not even take it out of top tier contention on its own, which I think is crazy to say. But I do think that the new Adagnister cards really push it to another level. And I think for that reason, I think March Hare probably needs either a semi limit or a limit. I think I'm going to go limited on it. It may sound like I'm being quite harsh on Malice, and full disclosure, I'm not a particularly big fan of the deck. I think that the deck, in my opinion, just doesn't play to the gameplay or game style that I like to play, which is kind of like build a board through infinite interactions and then make it so your opponent doesn't get to play the game. What I love about the new Justice Hunters formats is it feels like none of the decks really do that outside of like Canine Crystron. But stuff like Canine Vanquish Soul or Draco Tail or Yummy all put up a bunch of bodies and pieces of interaction, but they still allow you to play the game and then somewhat even rely on you playing the game in order to facilitate their plays and combos. So it feels like a nice back and forth where both players are active on both players' turns, and there's tons of like interplay between all of the decks where big chains can build up and you can get a ton of bodies back and Yummy quick synchros or the Holly Suit take or summon for the deck, or the Lupus Quick Exes. There's a lot of interesting and intricate timings that you get to take place with the current Justice Summers format, and I don't think Malice is particularly conducive to that. In the sense that like it does still banish on your turn and summon things back, but they're almost always like that happens once, and then they have now a big white binder that banishes your resources and you lose, or they have summon back Heart Scripter, banish your main combo starter, and you lose. Um, And this combined with like the added Mister Omni Negate and stuff like that does feel quite frustrating to me. So I think I do need to be a bit harsh on Malice, and I expect Konami to also be quite harsh on Malice, given that it's seeing significantly more tournament success than Mitsurugi and those other variants post Justice Hunters, which is something I think they want to curb to push the new product. We'll talk about all the mulch armies next together. Meows and Perulia are fine. Perulia is particularly strong this format, being checked to Canine Vanquish Soul, Canine variants in general. Yummy doesn't really summon that much from the hand, so it doesn't check them, but at least forces them to go for different lines. But at the end of the day, it only does still check summons from hand. And I think that those are one of the weaker ways to summon and combo. And so I think that Perulia is totally healthy for the game. Fuelos, on the other hand, I think is becoming a problem. It is a really strong going second tool, and I do appreciate that it's really only strong going second. If you draw it going first, it's almost a dead card. With that being said, it's so strong going second, forcing decks to make half boards or give you 3+ draws in order to set up their boards. Makes it so that you're just at such a resource advantage compared to your opponent. That combine this with other hand traps or board breakers, it really just becomes oppressive. I think we're seeing Fuelos played at almost like 93% of decks at 3 copies in every deck in the main deck, which is something that I think concerns me quite a bit about a card that's really only designed to be going second, because in general, decks are building to go first, and when you have a card that's just so strong going second, you'll see it at that kind of prevalence level, like we're seeing with something like this. So with that in mind, I think a light hit to Fuelos is warranted. I don't think we necessarily need to ban it by any stretch, and I don't think it necessarily needs to be limited quite yet. But I think testing the waters and semi-limiting it, just making it slightly more likely that you don't see your Fuelos, or especially a second Fuelos, when you're going second, can balance this out a bit. Makes people consider like other slots in the main deck, stuff like that. I think it still will be seed played at whatever the maximum copies legal is allowed, kind of like Maxi. But I think that the TCG has a pretty firm stance against Maxi. And I don't think that Fuelos solves the problems of Maxi adequately for it to be allowed to stick around at 3 copies. Closed Moon. This is another answer to how you solve the Fiendsmith splashability problem. If you don't want Fiendsmith to be splashable, banning Closed Moon does do a lot to help with that problem. But I don't think that any decks at the moment are particularly like feeling that Fiendsmith pushes them over the top to that like unplayable like against level. So I think Closed Moon Dodge is another ban list. And I honestly don't see it getting banned in the future. I think just naturally over time, Fiendsmith will just it'll probably still be around because it's such a potent like advantage engine in the graveyard. It gives you a lot of recursion across multiple turns. But setting up one Omni Negate or the 2 Summon Negates against the top stacks just don't do it anymore. It's nice when that's on top of the rest of your board, like a Caesar plus a whole Yummy interaction set is quite strong. But I think that it's not strong enough to warrant a limit or sorry, a ban of Closed Moon, limiting Closed Moon. Summon Sorceress, they put this on here because it got the errata. It should come back to 3. With the errata, it's useless. They'll probably start with its limited just to test the waters, but the errata makes it functionally unplayable compared to what it used to do. So bring it back, no problems. And now we're on to more of like a discussion point on some of the cards I think might get hit from the newer decks, because for the most part, these were all the old guard up until this point. And I do think that Konami is going to be quite lenient if they hit any of the Justice Hunters decks at all. But I do think that some of the supplementary engines or cards that have been in the game prior to their release that are quite broken by them will likely get addressed on this ban list to sort of tone the power level slightly of those top decks. I think the poster child for this is Paradise Smasher. Recently banned on the OCG, a card that just allows you to shut off monster effects for your opponent 90% of the time based on your dice rolls is ridiculous. With the canine cards, especially when they're paired with Crystron or to a lesser extent Vanquish Soul, It's trivial to make this with 3 level 5s and just make it almost, like I said, 90% guaranteed that your opponent doesn't get monster effects for the rest of this turn and their next turn, basically shutting them out of the game and acting as an instant win button. I think getting this out of there makes it a lot more favorable to trade with the K9 decks in terms of hand traps and stuff, because right now it already hurts to hand trap the K9 cards because it turns on a lot of them if you use a monster hand trap. But it especially hurts because once you put them on a monster hand trap, they'll have enough bodies to make the Paradise Smasher, and that can just be game ending in a lot of scenarios. And it's for relatively minimal investment. I think like an Azuna plus any 5 if you had a monster effect activated in hand. He's Paradise Smasher for sure, or like I said, that 90% guarantee. So this card needs to get hit for sure. Vanquish Soul, I think, is an engine that is worth potentially hitting. It's not a direct hit to K9. There are other K9 variants out there like Crystron, which again I also want to potentially curb, and I think that's because the K9 Vanquish Soul and more to a more extent even K9 Crystron are the kind of like new build a board that's indestructible decks of the format. Like the crazy boards that K9 Crystron can put up are absolutely insane. And the amount of later interaction that K9 Vanquish Soul gets to set up is also quite absurd. With that in mind, I think that it's still probably too early to kill any of these decks by any stretch. We'll start with the Crystron hit because I think it could happen. That would be like a semi-limit to Sulfador. The deck does already struggle with 5s and getting a good 5 onto the board with their Jokul. And so semi-limiting Sulfador takes 1 copy away of their best 5 to pair with Jokul to make the insane end boards. It still allows them to play. This doesn't hurt pure Crystron at all because they played 2 anyways. But it makes them reconsider if they want to play like a third Sulfador or if you need to bump your K9 count higher, something like that to compensate for that. But it's just a light slap on the wrist, nothing major. And the Paradise Smashers is a more so direct hit to that strategy in particular. So I think those 2 combined will curb it to a much more acceptable power level. For Vanquish Soul, I was kind of torn between these 2 as a card to potentially hit if they do get hit, and I think I landed on a limit of Rocket the Vanquisher. You might get confused on why I would possibly limit Rocket the Vanquisher, because a lot of times they're just making the 1 and as part of their turn 1 board, summoning back a guy and or adding it back to hand and adding that onto their combo board. But I think 1 Vanquisher does 2 important things. 1, it means that if you out the Rock of the Vanquisher, it's very hard for them to get it back into rotation. It's not a Vanquish Soul card, so it's very hard for them to interact with it, and it does make it so that they can't, on future turns, once you've cracked that turn 1 board, go into another rock to recur all their resources again. Raisin, on the other hand, if you limited it, it would just hurt the deck's already pretty crappy consistency, which I think would do a solid amount to hit the deck, probably even too much so, given how much the deck bricks already. So I think this is a fair compromise. And then the other thing that this does is it dissuades people from playing the Pot of Extravagance builds of the deck. A lot of people are like playing this at 3 copies and then throwing Pot of Extravagance for extra draws and consistency. And when you only have 1 Rock of the Vanquisher, it can be very risky to play that Pot of Extravagance because if you banish it and it's gone from your extra deck, that really hurts a lot of your resilience to hand traps and stuff like that. Like if your Raisin gets hit and then you don't have a way to get it back with Rock, then you might just be cut off from all of your Vanquish Soul combos both on this turn and the next turn, which can be absolutely devastating. So I'd be interested to see if they go this route. They might not touch it at all, and that might just be fine because while I do think that Can Vanquish Soul is the best deck in the format, at least at the moment, that's what the tournament results are showing. I do think that it's not an absurd power level, especially with like Paradise Smashers going. It's like they don't have their plan B win the game on the spot line anymore. So this brings them down a notch and would keep them well as still in meta. The last card I want to talk about is Thrust. I think that Thrust is in an interesting spot where there's just so many powerful one of cards that you can play to shut down top decks. Whether that's Featherstorm, like we talked about here, whether that's Obedience Schooled and Yummy, or even just another copy of like Dominus Purge or Impulse. Whether that's a Dark Ruler no more, whether that's a Raigeki. This card just acts as such an insanely flexible searcher, going second, and even potentially going first if you get hand trapped. Like, it just seems so powerful, this format, that I have concerns about it sticking around at 3 copies. I think it probably should go to 1 alongside its other triple talents brother, just because of how insanely strong it is to search any normal spell or trap in the game. It really punishes interaction from your opponent, which some people might argue is good. I think it punishes it way too much. So at least with 1 copy, you can't really rely on thrust searching your main board breakers consistently anymore. And it will force you to either play more copies of a specific board breaker as opposed to this being basically any copy of any board breaker that you need for a given situation. This card is just a bit too versatile, and I think it's problematic. But yeah, I want to keep it somewhat short. I realized I ended up going like 25 minutes ish, so not exactly the shortest ban list prediction, but I think a lot shorter than some of my other ones in the past. But this is my overall prediction for what I think Konami will do with the current format. Obviously, leaving the Justice Hunters decks well intact, hitting some of the old guard, hitting some of the more generic problem pieces, bringing back some stuff. But if you have any thoughts on this, any cards I missed, any issues with any of my decisions or thought processes, let me know down in the comments. I'd love to discuss more. I'm not perfect. I have played a lot of this format in the previous format, but I still, am prone to, making mistakes or forgetting about things or interactions or cards. So let me know. We can discuss it more in the comments. But thank you so much for watching. I appreciate every single one of you. If you like this kind of content and want to see more, go ahead, drop a like on this video and subscribe to the channel so that way I know that I'm doing something right and will make content like this. But without further ado, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye!